Red Bull just did something nobody expected, days before the first race of the season. And it could change everything. We are less than a week away from the Australian Grand Prix. The lights are about to go out for the first time this year. And behind the scenes, Red Bull and Ford have quietly refined the most important weapon in modern Formula One. Not a new wing. Not a visible upgrade. The engine behavior itself. After Bahrain testing, rivals labeled the Ford RBPT as the benchmark in power and efficiency. Top speed advantage. Minimal energy clipping. Relentless acceleration. Now, just before Melbourne, Red Bull has recalibrated energy deployment modes, torque delivery maps, and overtake logic to match the stop-and-go nature of Albert Park. That is not random. That is targeted. Because more than half of decisive overtakes in today's Formula One happen either at the start or within the first lap. If your engine launches perfectly and deploys efficiently down the first straight, you control the race. If you hesitate, you chase. And chasing Red Bull is a nightmare. Even more surprising? Max Verstappen is publicly downplaying expectations, saying they still need a step forward. But when the fastest engine on the grid gets even more refined, that is not caution. That is confidence. So the real question is simple. Did Red Bull just sharpen an already dominant weapon in time for Australia? Or are they hiding something even bigger? Stay with me. Because what Ford and Red Bull have adjusted inside that power unit could decide the first race before Turn 1 even arrives. Red Bull is not bringing a brand new engine to Australia. And that is exactly why this is so dangerous. Because when the hardware stays the same, but the behavior changes, it means the base package was already strong. The RB22 that arrives in Melbourne is essentially the evolved version we saw in Bahrain. Extreme side pods. A refined floor. A rear end optimized for straight line efficiency. That big step already happened. Australia is about precision. Ford and Red Bull have focused on energy deployment maps, overtake mode calibration, torque delivery on corner exit. And that matters more than most people realize. Because under the current regulations, power is not just about peak numbers. It is about how intelligently you release it. Deploy too aggressively at the wrong moment and you overheat tires. Deploy too conservatively and your rival pulls alongside before the braking zone. The difference is often a few tenths. And a few tenths at the start is the difference between leading into Turn 1 or fighting in traffic. Here is what makes this fascinating. After Bahrain, multiple teams quietly admitted that the Ford power unit looked like the benchmark in straight-line efficiency. Not just fast. Efficient. Minimal energy clipping at the end of straights. Strong acceleration phases. Stable deployment patterns. That is already a weapon. Now imagine refining that weapon specifically for Albert Park. Melbourne is a stop-and-go circuit. Heavy braking. Short bursts of acceleration. Medium-length straights where deployment timing is everything. So what Red Bull has done is adjust torque maps to improve traction out of slow corners. Refine ERS deployment to maintain energy availability toward the end of each lap. Optimize overtake mode logic to comply with stricter FIA monitoring while preserving straight-line strength. That is not a gamble. That is controlled evolution. And this is where the psychological layer appears. Max Verstappen has been unusually cautious in his public comments. He says they still need a step forward. He says it will not be easy. But when a team already considered the benchmark makes targeted refinements instead of emergency changes, that is not weakness. That is confidence. Confidence that the foundation is solid. Confidence that small gains are enough. Because when you start from the front, you do not need revolutions. You need margins. And margins are exactly what these refinements target. If the RB22 launches cleanly and maintains its straight-line efficiency under Melbourne's conditions, it immediately controls track position. And once Red Bull controls track position, strategy becomes a weapon. Dirty air becomes someone else's problem. Energy management becomes easier. Tire degradation becomes manageable. So while headlines may scream about major upgrades, the real story is smarter than that. Red Bull did not reinvent the engine. They optimized how it breathes, how it delivers, how it defends. And in modern Formula One, that kind of quiet precision is often more terrifying than a dramatic new part. Because when the lights go out in Australia, it will not be the loudest engine that wins the first meters. It will be the one that deploys power perfectly. But here is where things become even more interesting. Because refining the engine maps is only part of the equation. The real question is how those refinements interact with the new FIA oversight on active aerodynamics and energy deployment. The governing body has been watching closely. Especially when it comes to how teams manage overtake modes and electrical release. That means Red Bull cannot simply unleash everything. They must operate within tighter visibility. So what did they do? They adjusted the logic. Not just how much energy is deployed, but when, and how smoothly. Under the new directives, sudden spikes in speed delta are monitored more carefully, which means deployment must feel seamless, progressive, almost invisible. If executed correctly, it creates the illusion of effortless speed. And that is dangerous, because a car that accelerates smoothly is harder to attack than one that relies on aggressive bursts. Now combine that with Melbourne's layout. Albert Park rewards traction. Turn 3 exit. Turn 6 acceleration. The final corner leading onto the main straight. Each of those moments demands perfect torque modulation. If the rear tires hook up cleanly and the energy release remains strong toward the end of the straight, Red Bull controls the rhythm of the race. And rhythm is everything. Because once you dictate pace at the front, you force rivals into uncomfortable decisions. Push harder and risk tire degradation. Conserve and lose track position. Now imagine this scenario. The lights go out. The RB22 launches cleanly. No hesitation. No excessive wheel spin. It holds the inside into turn 1. Down the first straight, energy deployment is efficient, controlled, relentless. Ferrari cannot edge alongside. Mercedes cannot outdrag them. Suddenly, the race becomes a management exercise for Red Bull. And that is when they are at their strongest. But here is the tension. If the recalibration is even slightly conservative to satisfy FIA oversight, there could be a marginal reduction in peak aggression. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to open a small window. And in modern Formula 1, small windows are invitations. Ferrari looks sharp on long runs. Mercedes is refining its own engine mapping. The margins are thinner than ever. Which is why these Ford engine refinements matter so much. Red Bull is not chasing performance. They are protecting advantage, optimizing efficiency, ensuring the power unit remains the benchmark without crossing regulatory lines. And that balance is incredibly delicate. Because too much caution costs tenths. Too much aggression invites scrutiny. So Australia becomes the first real validation. Full race load. High pressure launch. Constant traction demands. Active aero mode cycling lap after lap. If the refined deployment strategy works under those conditions, Red Bull does not just start strong. They reinforce dominance. But if even a slight vulnerability appears, the chasing pack will sense it immediately. And that is why this is bigger than a typical pre-race tweak. It is not about adding horsepower. It is about refining control. About shaping how power feels. About turning raw speed into strategic stability. When the lights go out in Melbourne, do not just watch the lap time graphics. Watch how the Red Bull accelerates. Watch how it behaves in the first sector. Watch whether it looks effortless. Because if it does, then these Ford refinements were not minor at all. They were decisive. And the first race of the season may already tilt in their favor before the championship truly begins. And now we arrive at the part that could quietly decide the direction of the entire season. Because this is not just about Melbourne. It is about momentum. Red Bull has built its recent dominance on one core principle: operational precision. Not just raw speed. Not just clever aerodynamics, but the ability to execute perfectly under pressure. Clean starts, efficient deployment, strategic control. And when you combine a power unit already labeled the benchmark with refined energy mapping tailored to a stop-and-go circuit, you are not experimenting. You are consolidating strength. But here is the psychological twist. Max Verstappen's public caution is not accidental. When a driver says, "We still need a step forward," it does two things. It lowers expectation. And it removes external pressure. That creates freedom. Freedom to attack without the weight of assumed dominance. Freedom to surprise. Because if Red Bull arrives and immediately controls the race, the narrative becomes clear. They were sandbagging. If they struggle slightly, the expectation shield is already in place. That is smart. Now think about the championship dynamic. Ferrari appears composed over long runs. Mercedes is aggressively refining its engine behavior. The gap at the front is smaller than many expected, which makes every marginal gain critical. The Ford RBPT does not need a revolution. It needs consistency. If energy deployment remains stable over an entire stint, if torque maps preserve traction without overheating the rear tires, Red Bull becomes extremely difficult to challenge strategically. Because once they control tire life and deployment balance, rivals are forced into reactive decisions. And reactive racing is inefficient racing. But here is the real tension. Modern Formula 1 championships are not won by dramatic early dominance. They are won by eliminating vulnerabilities. Red Bull's vulnerability, if any, lies in regulatory tightening, active aero oversight, energy deployment monitoring, the need to stay within ever clearer FIA limits. So their task is delicate. Preserve straight-line advantage. Maintain acceleration superiority. Avoid drawing regulatory attention. That is a narrow corridor to operate within. And Australia is the first real stress test of that balance. Full power modes. Race intensity. No more controlled testing runs. If the RB22 launches cleanly, deploys energy smoothly, and shows no clipping at the end of the straights, then the refinement strategy has succeeded. If there is even a small reduction in their straight-line dominance, Ferrari and Mercedes will sense it immediately. And once rivals sense vulnerability, they attack relentlessly. That is Formula One. So as we approach the Australian Grand Prix, understand this. Red Bull did not shock the paddock with a dramatic hardware change. They shocked it by making a strong engine smarter. More controlled, more efficient, more precise. And sometimes, the most powerful evolution is not louder. It is smoother. When the lights go out in Melbourne, watch the first acceleration phase. Watch how the Red Bull pulls through the gears. Watch how effortlessly it stretches down the straight. Because if it looks calm, controlled, and untouchable, then the message is clear. Red Bull did not just prepare for race one. They prepared to protect their throne from the very first lap of the season.